The Canadian Armed Forces, or Canadian Forces, is the unified armed force of Canada, as constituted by the National Defence Act, which states, "The Canadian Forces are the armed forces of Her Majesty raised by Canada and consist of one service called the Canadian Armed Forces." This unified institution consists of sea, land, and air elements referred to as the Royal Canadian Navy, Canadian Army, and Royal Canadian Air Force. Personnel may belong to either the regular force or the reserve force, which has four subcomponents: the Primary Reserve, Supplementary Reserve, Cadet Organizations Administration and Training Service, and the Canadian Rangers. Under the National Defence Act, the Canadian Armed Forces are an entity separate and distinct from the Department of National Defence, which also exists as the civilian support system for the forces. The Commander-in-Chief of the Canadian Armed Forces is the reigning Canadian monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, who is represented by the Governor-General of Canada. The Canadian Armed Forces is led by the Chief of the Defence Staff, who is advised and assisted by the Armed Forces Council. Defence policy. Since the Second World War, Canadian defence policy has consistently stressed three overarching objectives: the defence of Canada itself, the defence of North America in cooperation with U.S. forces, contributing to broader international security. During the Cold War, a principal focus of Canadian defence policy was contributing to the security of Europe in the face of the Soviet military threat. Toward that end, Canadian ground and air forces were based in Europe from the early 1950s until the early 1990s. However, since the end of the Cold War, as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization has moved much of its defense focus out of area, the Canadian military has also become more deeply engaged in international security operations in various other parts of the world, most notably in Afghanistan since 2002. Canadian defence policy today is based on the Canada First Defence Strategy, introduced in 2008. Based on that strategy, the Canadian military is oriented and being equipped to carry out 6 core missions within Canada, in North America and globally. Specifically, the Canadian Armed Forces are tasked with having the capacity to conduct daily domestic and continental operations, including in the Arctic and through NORAD, support a major international event in Canada, such as the 2010 Winter Olympics, respond to a major terrorist attack, support civilian authorities during a crisis in Canada such as a natural disaster, lead in, or conduct a major international operation for an extended period, and deploy forces in response to crises elsewhere in the world for shorter periods. Consistent with the missions and priorities outlined above, the Canadian Armed Forces also contribute to the conduct of Canadian defence diplomacy through a range of activities, including the deployment of Canadian defence attachés, participation in bilateral and multilateral military forums, ship and aircraft visits, military training and cooperation, and other such outreach and relationship-building efforts. History. Origins and establishment. Prior to Confederation in 1867, residents of the colonies in what is now Canada served as regular members of French and British forces and in local militia groups. The latter aided in the defence of their respective territories against attacks by other European powers, Aboriginal peoples, and later American forces during the American Revolutionary War and War of 1812, as well as in the Fenian Raids, Red River Rebellion, and Northwest Rebellion. Consequently, the lineages of some Canadian Army units stretch back to the early 19th century, when militia units were formed to assist in the defense of British North America against invasion by the United States. The responsibility for military command remained with the British Crowning Council, with a Commander-in-Chief for North America stationed at Halifax until the final withdrawal of British Army and Royal Navy units from that city in 1906. Thereafter, the Royal Canadian Navy was formed, and, with the advent of military aviation, the Royal Canadian Air Force. These forces were organized under the Department of Militia and Defense, and split into the permanent and non-permanent active militias, frequently shortened to simply the militia. By 1923, the department was merged into the Department of National Defense, but land forces in Canada were not referred to as the Canadian Army until November 1940. The first overseas deployment of Canadian military forces occurred during the Second Boer War, when several units were raised to serve under British command. Similarly, when the United Kingdom entered into conflict with Germany in the First World War, Canadian troops were called to participate in European theatres. The Canadian Crown and Council then decided to send its forces into the Second World War, as well as the Korean War. Since 1947, Canadian military units have participated in more than 200 operations worldwide, and completed 72 international operations. Canadian soldiers, sailors, and aviators came to be considered world-class professionals through conspicuous service during these conflicts and the country's integral participation in NATO during the Cold War, First Gulf War, Kosovo War, and in United Nations peacekeeping operations, such as the Suez Crisis, Golan Heights, Cyprus, Croatia, Bosnia, Afghanistan, and Libya. Canada maintained an aircraft carrier from 1957 to 1970 during the Cold War, which never saw combat but participated in patrols during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Battles which are particularly notable to the Canadian military include the Battle of Vimy Ridge, the Jet Raid, the Battle of Ortona, the Battle of Passchendaele, the Normandy landings, the Battle for Caen, the Battle of the Scheldt, the Battle of Britain, the Battle of the Atlantic, the strategic bombing of German cities, and more recently the Battle of Medic Pocket, in Croatia. At the end of the Second World War, Canada possessed the fourth-largest air force and fifth-largest naval surface fleet in the world, as well as the largest volunteer army ever fielded. Conscription for overseas service was introduced only near the end of the war, and only 2,400 conscripts actually made it into battle. Originally, Canada was thought to have had the third-largest navy in the world, but with the fall of the Soviet Union, new data based on Japanese and Soviet sources found that to be incorrect. Since unification, the current iteration of the Canadian Armed Forces dates from 1 February 1968, when the Royal Canadian Navy, Canadian Army, and Royal Canadian Air Force were merged into a unified structure and superseded by elemental commands. Its roots, however, lie in colonial militia groups that served alongside garrisons of the French and British armies and navies, a structure that remained in place until the early 20th century. Thereafter, a distinctly Canadian Army and Navy was established, followed by Air Force, that, because of the constitutional arrangements at the time, remained effectively under the control of the British government until Canada gained legislative independence from the United Kingdom in 1931, in part due to the distinguished achievement and sacrifice of the Canadian Corps in the First World War. After the 1980s, the use of the Canadian Armed Forces name gave way to Canadian Forces. The Canadian Armed Forces name returned in 2013. Land forces during this period also deployed in support of peacekeeping operations within United Nations-sanctioned conflicts. The nature of the Canadian forces has continued to evolve. They have been deployed in Afghanistan until 2011, under the NATO-led United Nations International Security Assistance Force. At the request of the government of Afghanistan, the armed forces are today funded by approximately $20.1 billion annually and are presently ranked 74th in size compared to the world's other armed forces by number of total personnel, and 58th in terms of active personnel, standing at a strength of roughly 68,000, plus 27,000 reservists, 5,000 rangers, and 19,000 supplementary reserves, bringing the total force to approximately 119,000. The number of primary reserve personnel is expected to go up to 30,000 by 2020, and the number of active to at least 70,000. In addition, 5,000 Rangers and 19,000 supplementary personnel will be serving. If this happens, the total strength would be around 124,000. These individuals serve on numerous CF bases located in all regions of the country, and are governed by the Queen's Regulations and Orders and the National Defence Act. In 2008, the Government of Canada made efforts, through the Canada First Defence Strategy, to modernise the Canadian Armed Forces, through the purchase of new equipment, improved training and readiness, as well as the establishment of the Canadian Special Operations Regiment. More funds were also put towards recruitment, which had been dwindling throughout the 1980s and 90s, possibly because the Canadian populace had come to perceive the CAF as peacekeepers rather than as soldiers, as shown in a 2008 survey conducted for the Department of National Defence. The poll found that nearly two-thirds of Canadians agreed with the country's participation in the invasion of Afghanistan, and that the military should be stronger, but also that the purpose of the forces should be different, such as more focused on responding to natural disasters. Then CD's Walter Natanchik said later that year that while recruiting has become more successful, the CF was facing a problem with its rate of loss of existing members, which increased between 2006 and 2008 from 6% to 9.2% annually. The 2006 renewal and re-equipment effort has resulted in the acquisition of specific equipment to support the mission in Afghanistan. It has also encompassed initiatives to renew certain so-called core capabilities. In addition, new systems have also been acquired for the armed forces. Although the viability of the Canada First Defence Strategy continues to suffer setbacks from challenging and evolving fiscal and other factors, it originally aimed to increase the number of military personnel to 70,000 regular forces and 30,000 primary reserve forces, replace the Royal Canadian Navy's current auxiliary oiler ships with 2 to 3 new vessels under the Joint Support Ship Project, build 15 warships to replace existing destroyers and frigates under the Single-Class Surface Combatant Project, acquire new Arctic Patrol vessels under the Arctic Patrol Ship Project, replace the current Maritime Patrol aircraft with 10 to 12 new patrol aircraft, strengthen readiness and operational capabilities, and improve and modernize defense infrastructure. Role of women in the 1950s. The recruitment of women was open to roles in medicine, communication, logistics, and administration. The roles of women in the CAF began to expand in 1971, after the department reviewed the recommendations of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, at which time it lifted the ceiling of 1,500 women personnel, and gradually expanded employment opportunities into the non-traditional areas: vehicle drivers and mechanics, aircraft mechanics, air traffic controllers, military police, and firefighters. The department further reviewed personnel policies in 1978 and 1985, after Parliament passed the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. As a result of these reviews, the department changed its policies to permit women to serve at sea in replenishment ships and in a diving tender, with the Army service battalions, in military police platoons and field ambulance units, and in most air squadrons. In 1987, occupations and units with the primary role of preparing for direct involvement in combat on the ground or at sea were still closed to women. Infantry, Armored Corps, Field Artillery, Air Defense Artillery, Signals, Field Engineers, and Naval Operations. On 5 February 1987, the Minister of National Defence created an office to study the impact of employing men and women in combat units. These trials were called Combat-Related Employment of Women. All military occupations were open to women in 1989, with the exception of submarine service, which opened in 2000. Throughout the 1990s, the introduction of women into the combat arms increased the potential recruiting pool by about 100%. It also provided opportunities for all persons to serve their country to the best of their abilities. Women were fully integrated in all occupations and roles by the government of John Chrétien, and by the 8th of March 2000, even allowed to serve on submarines. All equipment must be suitable for a mixed-gender force. Combat helmets, rucksacks, combat boots, and flak jackets are designed to ensure women have the same level of protection and comfort as their male colleagues. The women's uniform is similar in design to the men's uniform, but conforms to the female figure, and is functional and practical. Women are also provided with an annual financial entitlement for the purchase of brassiere undergarments.